Okay. First thing I want to talk about today is how do you know which formula to use? So I'm going to give you some examples. We're going to try to figure out which formula should be used in each of my examples. And I've labeled them. You can do this on your paper if you want. This is a transparency of the formula sheet you have, which you get to use on the Chapter 7 test and the Chapter 7 review assignment, which is what you're going to do today in class. And you can see Formula A, it's a formula for the confidence interval for the mean when the population standard deviation is known. But then in parentheses it says, if n is greater than or equal to 30, S can be used when the standard deviation of the population is unknown. So use that formula if you know sigma. If you don't know sigma, but your n is greater than or equal to 30, you can still use that formula, but you're going to use your sample standard deviation S in place of sigma. Formula B, that's if you're trying to find sample size and you're trying to estimate a mean or an average. Formula C, the confidence interval for the mean when your sigma, that's your population standard deviation, is unknown, so you don't know it, and your sample size is less than 30. Then you're going to use this formula. Notice the two formulas are basically the same, except for instead of z-scores, you're going to use t-scores. That's going to be one important thing to recognize. If they don't give you the population standard deviation, and if your sample size is less than 30, you have to remember to use t-scores instead of z-scores. D, formula for the confidence interval for a proportion. Notice we use z-scores on this formula. E, formula for the sample size. If you're trying to find sample size and you want to estimate a proportion, use E. F, that's what we did on lesson 7.5, formula for the confidence interval for a variance. One easy way you can tell what you're estimating is look at the thing in the middle. See, that's a variance symbol in the middle. So you're trying to estimate variance. Normally then once you get that answer, you just square root the left side and the right side, and that gives you this answer down here. All right, here's some examples. I want to know the proportion of volleyball players who have knee injuries. And I want to know how many people to survey. Okay, I want to do a study on what proportion of volleyball players have knee injuries. And I want to do a study, and I want to know how many people I need to survey. Which formula would I use? A, B, C, D, E, or F, or G?
What was the question?
Yeah, can you repeat that?
If I want to know what percent or proportion of volleyball players get knee injuries. So that should, when I hear the word proportion, you should zero in on either D or E, because those are the ones that have a p hat in them, sample proportion. But I want to know how many people I need to survey. E. Yep. If I want to know how many people to survey, then I'm trying to find n. So I'm going to use formula E. So if the problem involves a proportion and I want to find the sample size, use n. Use E. Excuse me. On those, these two formulas that find sample size always round up. On those, when you're finding n, if you get 22.1, round it up to 23 people, 23 volleyball players, or 23 dogs, whatever your sample is. Okay. All right, let's do a different one. Let's say I want to know the average ACT score at West Delaware. And I want to come up with a confidence interval for the average ACT score at West Delaware. And let's say I don't know the population standard deviation. Let's say I'm going to survey 50 people. Survey 50 people. I've got probably 50 people who have taken the ACT in my classes. And find out, ask them what their ACT score was, their composite, and use that to come up with a confidence interval for the average ACT score at West Delaware. Which? A. Yep. A is, see that symbol in the middle? That's mean. So I'm finding average ACT, so that's your mean. And my sample size I said was 50. That's bigger than 30, so use formula A. Okay. What if I was trying to find average ACT score and my sample size was 20 students? What if I just took 20 people in this room that have taken the test and say, hey, write down your score on a piece of paper, I'm going to use that to find a confidence interval. Which formula would I use then?
C.
C. Yep. If I don't know the population standard deviation, if my sample size is only 20, which is less than 30, I'm trying to estimate a mean, average ACT score, I'd use C. Any questions so far?
So if it's greater than 30 or if it's less than 30 but you know the standard deviation, you use A.
Good question. She said, if it's greater than 30, or no, you said if it's less than
Yeah.
30, but you know, if you know the standard deviation of the population, then you'd use this. Okay. Now, let's say you only know the sample standard deviation, and your n is less than 30, then you'd use this one. You have to know the population standard deviation, which normally you don't. But if n is less than 30, you're going to use this formula, unless they tell you the population standard deviation, then you go up and use this formula. All right, how about I want to find out average number of tackles by our linebackers. And I want to know how many linebackers I need to survey. Maybe I look at, through history, I go back, call up a bunch of linebackers from West Delaware, want to know the average number of tackles, but I need to say I want to be 90% confident, and I want to know how many linebackers do I have to call up and talk to, or look up their stats, see how many tackles they've had. If I want to know how many people, and I'm trying to estimate average number of tackles, which formula?
B.
B. Yep, B. I'm trying to find how many people, that's n, your sample size, and I'm talking about an average or a mean. All right. What if I want to go out to Dairy Queen and I want to look at how much their blizzards, their medium blizzard, I'm going to weigh them. Every time they make a medium blizzard, I'm going to weigh it and see how many ounces it is. And I want to know how much variation there is. I want to get a confidence interval for the variance of the weights of medium blizzards at Dairy Queen.
Okay.
F. Yep. That's variance. So confidence interval for variance. And then if I want a confidence interval for standard deviation, I just take the square root of both of these numbers, and I'll have this answer. What if I want to estimate the proportion of music students that make All-State at West Delaware? I want to find out, on average, what percent of our music students make All-State, vocal students I'm talking about, what percent make All-State? So I go and maybe I look at 100 students who have been in chorus over the last few years, and I look at how many make All-State, and I try to come up with a confidence interval showing an estimate of what proportion of music students are going to make All-State.
D.
D. Yep. I'm estimating a proportion, that's P, and I'm doing a confidence interval for proportions, you'd use D. Any other questions? The key is to read carefully. Read the questions carefully. Most of you are going to do really well on this test.